For centuries, the battlefields of Europe weren't just fought on by national armies. They were dominated by soldiers for hire, men who sold their loyalty and their lives to the highest bidder. These mercenary groups, or war dogs, became some of the most feared and effective fighting forces in history. But among them, three stood out: the Swiss pikemen, the German Landsknechts, and the Italian Condottieri. So, who was the best? Let's dive into the brutal, bloody world of Europe's most notorious mercenaries. Our story begins in the late Middle Ages, a time of constant warfare. Kings and princes needed armies, but raising and training soldiers was expensive and time-consuming. The solution: hire professionals. And nobody was more professional than the Swiss. Emerging from the rugged Alps, the Swiss perfected a new way of fighting. Armed with incredibly long pikes, sometimes over 18 feet long, they formed massive, disciplined squares that were virtually unstoppable. Imagine a moving fortress of steel-tipped spears, a hedgehog of death rolling across the battlefield. Cavalry charges, which had dominated warfare for 1,000 years, shattered against these pike walls. The Swiss weren't just soldiers. They were a brotherhood, bound by fierce loyalty to their canton and their comrades. Their motto was, "No money, no Swiss," a clear declaration that their skill came at a price. Their victories at battles like Morgarten and Sempach cemented their reputation. For over a century, if you wanted to win a battle, you hired the Swiss. They were the gold standard, the undisputed kings of the battlefield. But their dominance couldn't last forever. Seeing the success of the Swiss, their neighbors, the Germans, decided to copy them with a twist. Enter the Landsknechts. The name literally means servant of the country, created by the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. The Landsknechts took the Swiss pike formation and made it their own. But they added something new and devastating: the Zweihander, a massive two-handed sword. These swordsmen would rush forward, often as a suicide squad called the Forlorn Hope, to break the enemy's pike line, creating gaps for their own pikemen to exploit. The Landsknechts were also famous for their flamboyant and ridiculously colorful clothing, a stark contrast to their brutal profession. They were a riot of slashed sleeves, feathered hats, and mismatched stockings. But don't let the fashion fool you. They were every bit as ruthless as the Swiss. In fact, a bitter and personal rivalry developed between the two groups. When Swiss and Landsknechts met on the battlefield, it was a fight to the death. No quarter was asked, and none was given. They were the punks of the Renaissance battlefield: loud, violent, and incredibly effective. Meanwhile, to the south, Italy was a fractured landscape of warring city-states. Here, a different kind of mercenary captain rose to prominence: the Condottieri. The word comes from condotta, the contract that bound them to their employer. Unlike the infantry-heavy Swiss and Germans, the Condottieri were masters of maneuver and cavalry warfare. They led companies of heavily armored knights, known as men-at-arms, who could deliver a thunderous charge. But the Condottieri were more than just generals. They were entrepreneurs of violence. They were businessmen, politicians, and military leaders all rolled into one. Figures like Francesco Sforza went from being a hired sword to becoming the Duke of Milan himself. John Hawkwood, an Englishman, became one of the most famous and feared condottieri in Italy. However, Italian warfare was often seen as less decisive. Battles could be elaborate, almost chess-like affairs, with commanders trying to outmaneuver each other rather than seeking a bloody, decisive clash. This was partly because their soldiers were their assets, and losing them was bad for business. While they could be brutal when they needed to be, the condottieri played a different game, one of political ambition as much as military victory. So we have the Swiss, the unstoppable pike phalanx, the Landsknechts, the flamboyant and ferocious copycats, and the condottieri, the cunning cavalry commanders and political players. Who was the best? It's a tough question because it's like comparing a shark, a lion, and an eagle. Each was perfectly adapted to its environment. In a straight-up infantry fight on an open field, my money would be on the early Swiss. Their discipline and cohesion were legendary. They were a single, unstoppable machine. For nearly 200 years, their pike squares were the problem that every other army in Europe had to solve. However, the battlefield was changing. The introduction of firearms, like the arquebus, began to level the playing field. The dense formations of the Swiss and Landsknechts made them perfect targets for gunfire. The Landsknechts were perhaps quicker to adapt, integrating more firearms into their formations and using their aggressive tactics to close the distance quickly. The Italian wars of the late 15th and early 16th centuries became the ultimate testing ground. Here, Swiss Landsknechts, Spanish and French armies clashed in a whirlwind of pike, shot, and sword. At the Battle of Pavia in 1525, a combined force of Landsknechts and Spanish arquebusiers shattered the French army and its Swiss mercenaries. It marked a turning point, showing that the age of the pike alone was coming to an end. The future belonged to combined arms, the synergy of pike and shot. So, if the Swiss were the masters of the pure pike era, the Landsknechts were the masters of the transitional period. Their flexibility and willingness to embrace new technologies gave them an edge as warfare evolved. They combined the discipline of the pike square with the aggressive shock tactics of their swordsmen and the firepower of early guns. They represented the chaotic, violent, but innovative nature of Renaissance warfare. They weren't just imitating the Swiss, they were building on the formula and, for a time, arguably surpassing it. What about the condottieri? While they might lose a head-to-head fight against a pike square, their value wasn't just in winning a single battle. Their strength was strategic. They understood logistics, politics, and the long game. A condottiero might lose a battle but still win the war by securing a better contract, capturing a key city through treachery, or simply outlasting his opponent. They were the CEOs of war, managing risk and maximizing profit. Their influence wasn't just on the battlefield, but in the halls of power. In terms of long-term impact and political success, some condottieri were unmatched. Ultimately, the era of the great mercenary companies came to an end. The rise of powerful nation-states with their own professional, standing armies made mercenaries less essential. Gunpowder and artillery made their old tactics obsolete. But their legacy is undeniable. The Swiss taught Europe the power of disciplined infantry. The Landsknechts showed the importance of combined arms and aggressive tactics. And the Condottieri demonstrated that war was not just about fighting, but also about business and politics. So, who was the best? There's no single answer. The Swiss were the unbeatable originals. The Condottieri were the smartest players. But if I had to pick the most terrifying and effective force during the peak of European mercenary warfare, I'd give a slight edge to the Landsknechts. Their blend of Swiss discipline, aggressive shock troops, and early adoption of firearms made them the most dynamic and dangerous force on the rapidly changing Renaissance battlefield. They were the ultimate war dogs of a brutal age. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below who you would have hired. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more dives into history's most fascinating conflicts.